How's it going today? So I was listening to a podcast from Pixel Project Radio. I had not heard of them, I don't believe. And what intrigued me about their podcast is they had Quest 64 Official on. Do you know who Quest 64 Official is? He's got a Blue Sky and Twitter account and posts a lot of fun, goofy memes or whatever about Quest 64 and is a genuine Quest 64 enthusiast, a very hardcore Quest 64 fan. And I really enjoy what he does, and he has brought a lot of people in the Quest 64 community together with his memes and helped us connect to each other, actually, of people who are interested in Quest 64. I also happen to like Pokemon, though, quite a little bit, actually. I grew up with Pokemon. I think I was in like the 7th or 8th grade when Pokemon came out, and my buddies and I, we used to trade and collect Pokemon. So anyways, when I was listening to this podcast, they actually talked about Pokemon and Quest 64. So this really intrigued me, and I'm like, you know what? This would be a great comparison. This is not a video trying to compare Quest 64 to say which one is better or which franchise is better, because we know Pokemon won the war. You and I are not morons. We know Pokemon won the war in that regard, but I really like the idea of looking at these two things side by side because I really enjoy how they tackled RPGs in a very different sort of way. And there's a lot of similarities when I look at these two things that I did not expect to see. So I'm going to get right into it, what I think here. To me, the most major distinction between Quest 64 and Pokemon is the setting of the games. I mean, they both deal with monsters. Originally, Quest 64 in Japan is called L-Tail Monsters. Quest 64 takes place in a more traditional RPG setting. It's about wizards and knights and mages, and it has a very Ireland kind of feel to it, like that classical Irish tale. Whereas Pokemon takes place in a modern setting. They have, Pokeballs, they still fight monsters, but there's a lot of technology, and Pokemon are pets, basically, that fight. So it's a very different concept entirely. That's the major distinction between these two games. In this regard, they are not very much alike, but it is, again, the story of a young boy going on a journey. That's the big thing that they mainly have in common. What I think is really fascinating is Pokemon and Quest 64 were both on N64 and Game Boy. Of course, you got Pokemon Stadium, and then here's Pokemon Yellow as an example. I don't have Red and Blue anymore, but I did as a kid. I had Yellow as well. I had all three. I never really kind of got over first-gen Pokemon. I never played any much of the Pokemon games after that, but I did enjoy what I played of the original Gen 1 Pokemon. Obviously, Pokemon and Quest 64 are both RPGs, but both tackled RPGs in a very different way. Obviously, Pokemon Stadium was not really an RPG. This is more of a stadium battler, and these games, of course, have connectivity thanks to the N64 transfer pack. You could transfer your Pokemon from here to fight them in there. And with the special Pikachu edition, of course, the yellow Pokemon in here, you could actually do some things which would give Pikachu the ability to use water attacks, which was really freaking cool at the time. It really incentivized you to get an N64 and also have an original Game Boy or Game Boy Color, actually, more than anything. Because most people were playing Pokemon on Game Boy Color, even though it's an original Game Boy game. Now, these two particular games don't have any real interconnectivity. This is almost a de-imagining. I don't want to say a demake, because yes, it's the 8-bit version of Quest 64, but they added more lore and things like that, and it plays a little bit differently compared to this right here. But they both are great in their own right. A lot of people prefer this version, but still a lot of people really like this, and there's a lot of people with nostalgia for it. I recently played it like over a year ago and had an absolute blast with it. I struggled with this game. I struggled with it when I was a kid, but that's because I didn't really understand the concept of how to play it. But once I figured it out, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I see this. I played it and beat it in like 16 hours. Now, it might take you much less time if you know what you're doing. And that's half the battle. There's people who speedrun Quest 64. Speedrunning is very popular in regards to Quest 64. That's why a lot of people enjoy playing it. The other thing these two things have in common is they both have spin-off games. That's right. You got Pokemon Snap, also Pokemon Pinball. I remember that game as a kid and having an absolute blast with it. And then you have Quest Fantasy Challenge, which is like a Mr. Do clone or a Dig Dug clone maybe or something like that. Yeah, it's a fun game too, but obviously not as, enthralling as Quest RPG Brian's Journey on Game Boy or Quest 64 itself, very different genres, but it's cool that they expanded beyond simply being just RPGs. And that's something I think is really neat that they have in common. Another thing I think is kind of interesting is how they both approach world building. Quest 64 just seems more minimalist. I don't know what it is. It just seems like, yeah, there's a lot of characters in there. I think there's probably maybe more characters in Quest 64 as far as NPCs goes than there is in like Zelda 64, Zelda Ocarina of Time, But they typically just say like one thing, and they all have names, which is kind of a unique thing. Whereas it feels like with Pokemon, is minimalist too. It's minimalist too, like Quest 64, but as far as the Game Boy version, but it has a totally different vibe to it. It's about, as obviously they're both characters who are, on a long journey, young kid on a long journey, which is pretty typical, prototypical of any kind of RPG. But you feel a different kind of connection with the characters in Pokemon because obviously you start the game at the beginning and, you meet Professor Oak and you meet your rival Gary and you see Gary throughout the game. And I guess you could say, well, Shannon is kind of that person because you see her throughout the game in Quest 64, but she doesn't say much. It feels like the rivalry between Gary and Ash is pretty intense. And yeah, and then of course Team Rocket, Team Rocket is in there throughout the game. And obviously if you ever watched the Pokemon cartoon back in the day, you would feel a totally different kind of connection to Pokemon than you would Quest 64, because Quest 64, sure, has some pretty deep lore when you really actually interact with every NPC, but you really gotta interact. You can't just simply be like, oh man, I'm just gonna fly through this game and understand what's going on. You won't. Whereas I feel like Pokemon wasn't quite like that. I mean, especially considering so much, I don't know, what is the word? So much additional content that was already out there, beyond simply the game. Quest 64 and the Quest series is much more minimalist, whereas Pokemon, as far as world building, they did an incredible job because they went so far beyond the video game itself. And there's no denying, and as I said at the beginning, Quest 64, it has a bit of a cult following more than anything, whereas Pokemon, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Pokemon is a freaking phenomenon, okay? It took the world by storm, and it was absolutely brilliant how they sold you multiple cartridges, and it's more of a social experience because you would trade Pokemon back and forth between, because the cartridges didn't have all Pokemon on one side. You had to have two to get all 150 or 151, actually, technically speaking. And to get 151, you had to get a Game Genie or win that contest or whatever to get Mew or whatever. I remember back in the day. Overall, I just feel like they're both great RPGs in their own right. I mean, Quest 64 was literally the first N64 RPG. And yeah, it got a little bit rushed. And the Japanese version obviously has a little bit more additional content and some quality of life updates. And of course, the Quest Brian's RPG is probably in a lot of respects how the game should have been, because that's how the creators approached Quest 64. It's like an 8-bit game with 64-bit graphics. But I do think the N64 version is great because the world just feels much bigger than the Quest RPG on Game Boy. But Pokemon, it's Pokemon. There's not much else I really need to say. It's an absolute worldwide phenomenon. And it has taken the world by storm and so many people have so much fond memories of playing Pokemon or getting the Pokemon toys and merchandise. And it's just, they're both great stories about, going on a long journey and, discovering a friendship and discovering of yourself. So anyways, what do you think? Is this a crazy comparison or what? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Anyways, stay awesome in this universe. Later.